Thank you, Jalal. Well, I think I was very happy to get all these questions and this discussion going. It's certainly a lot of fun. I think I've beaten the record for the fewest number of slides I've covered in an hour and a half. So that's quite something, but I take that as a good thing. Like I said, I figure that I have too many slides, so I never intended to cover the whole thing in detail. What I would like to do now is to continue moving on to the unit commitment and get to the more, try to get to the more interesting parts from the optimization perspective, finish the basic model and move on from there. So we've talked about these binary variables quite a bit, and the whole question of, how do you know this is a better choice or not? The startup cost, I just made a quick mention. Usually you have some startup cost when you start a unit that involves a boiler, but again, from the optimization perspective, this is not a big deal. Then we have these ramping constraints, and the ramping constraints basically say that you can only increase or decrease the amount of power output of a unit based on what it was the time before. Okay, so these have the form that the difference in power between t and t minus 1 is bounded above by an expression that depends on whether the unit was on or off. So if the unit was off, this will be 0, and then you get this kind of startup amount times the y. So this says I've just turned it on, so this is the maximum that I can be at. And otherwise, y will be 0, this will be 1, because v will be 1 because I was on the time before, and I have my ramping constraint from when I'm running. Okay, so you can have a different ramping amount depending on whether you just started up or whether you are already running for more than one period. Okay, so this is the ramp up constraint. The ramp down constraint is essentially the same thing, except you flip the difference between the p's, because now you're going down. And you've got a similar amount of ramp down amount, and the shutdown level here times z. Now this part here says if you want to turn off, you're going to have to be at a low enough level that you can turn off. Okay, so this constraint is also going to enforce that you can't turn off from a very high level. You have to, if you want to make z equal to 1, then you're going to have to be close enough. You're going to make this one 0. So the previous p has to be low enough for this amount that says you can't shut down from a very high level. You have to get down to a low enough level to shut down. Okay. So this constraint takes care of it automatically with the way it's set up. So now you start to see, with the ramping constraints, you start to see the interaction between the v and the y and the v and the z. Okay. So these kick in. And again, you could rewrite all this in terms of only v's or in terms of only y's and z's. But this seems to be a better way to do it in practice. You also have constraints that say you can't turn it on or off arbitrarily. Once it's on, it has to be on for a certain amount of time. When it's off, it has to be off for a certain amount of time. There's different forms for these constraints. The one that I have here basically says that if you turn on, so if your unit anytime within a certain number of time periods, one of these y's will be 1. So this is sort of looking back in time. Okay, the counter is looking back in time, and it's saying if you've just turned on within a certain number of periods, namely TU periods, then the v for now has to be 1. Okay, so the idea here is you sum up a whole bunch of y's, but only one of them at most is 1. And if one of them is 1, it means you've just turned on recently enough. My current v has to be 1. And if you look in the literature, you'll find different ways of expressing these. And the question about this is sort of similar to the other question of what's the better way to do it? Well, you have to experiment and see what works better. Okay. Then I have a similar one for downtime, and this one basically says, well, if any of the z's over a previous number of time periods, namely td, is 1, then this sum is going to be 1. This sum plus v is at most 1. So if this is 1, then this one has to be 0. So this one has a similar effect of saying if I've turned off recently enough, I have to be off at this time period. Okay. You look back into your previous decisions and you get what the value for V can be at this time period. One point that I want to mention, and that came up in a question during the break, is that I'm saying, you look back and you decide what your current V can be, but when you optimize, you do the solution for all the variables in one go. Okay? You're not time stepping through to decide what they can be. That would be what I would call more of a simulation approach. This is really, you solve the 24 hours in one go, but you guarantee consistency between the values in terms of the requirements by looking at what the variables are that you've decided for the previous periods. Okay? But when you do an optimization approach, you solve everything in one shot. So this gives us uptime and downtime constraints. Then there's also generation limits that were mentioned in a question earlier. So here what I say is that, well, the power output has to be between the low limit times V and the up limit times V. So if V is 0, then it has to be 0. If my unit is off, the P has to be 0 because it's squeezed between 0 and 0. If V is on, then it can fluctuate between these two values, upper and lower bound. And then I have this P bar. Remember, this is the one that has some reserve as well. The P bar has to be at least as much as the P. And is going to measure how much extra I have compared to what I schedule. And then I can also have some additional generation limits for the P bar to guarantee some consistency. These ones get a little bit more involved, but basically what they say is that, for example, this constraint 11 says that P bar can be no more than what I've output in the previous period plus what I can ramp. Okay, so even if I allow for reserve, the reserve amount has to fit within my ramping capability, right? I'm operating at a certain amount of time t minus 1. I plan to go to a certain amount of time t, a little higher. If I need some reserve and I want even higher still, then this higher still has to fit within my ramping. And the same thing for the ramp down in the second constraint. So when you put all this together, this is the optimization problem that you get. Okay, and this is in very small print so that it fits on a slide, but there's nothing new compared to what we've seen. It's all the things that we've gone through. And so your decisions are the P's, the P bars, and the binary variables. That's what you have to decide. And given the data that you have for the demand, the reserve, and the costs, and the various ramp ups, downs, and production limits, and so on, you can stick this into a solver and get some results. So maybe before I do that, let's go get the question over there. Thank you.
Thank you. I was wondering who would solve this model, because it seems like a social planner model. And then which entity would solve this in practice?
Who would solve this model? Basically, it would be the system operator, whoever that is, because this is the entity that's responsible for ensuring that there's enough generation capacity in the system to meet demand. Now, who that is depends on where you are. Okay.
Then the system operator would get the information about costs and so announce your bidding processes.
Yeah. Now, those costs now where do the costs come from? It may involve the market structure. It may involve some kind of clearing market beforehand of some sort, or you can use this to clear the market and decide on who gets the production based on the costs. There's a lot of different ways that you can do it. Yeah. But this is basically the problem of saying, if I know which generators are available and what price they're offering me, that's my costs, then I can make the optimal decision.
Okay, and just
Sure.
one last
Yeah.
question. Then it is also the system operator who is responsible for estimating.
Yes. or to have a reliable enough forecast of demand to make the decision. Yeah. Which then asks the question of if it's net demand and there's renewables, then would you actually have flexibility on the demand as well? I'm taking demand as an input, but in some cases you may be able to curtail renewables to change the demand to match what you do, right? So yeah, but it would have to be essentially the kind of entity that has all this information and can actually make, like you were saying, in some sense, optimal social decisions in this context. Okay, there's...
Using in the time scale, in the 1 hour time scale is where we solve the convector AC power flow or the economic dispatch or AC power flow. So what's the difference? What are we solving in this one?
What are we solving in this one? This one is typically day ahead. So I'm solving today to decide which units are on tomorrow, which means you have more time to make the decisions.
You don't take into account the constraints of the power system in terms of power lines, so it's like assuming a copper plate.
Power system. There's no power system yet.
So that's what you solve in the 1 hour ahead market.
I'll get to the power system in a moment, and then we can look at that. Okay, let's just postpone that for the time being. So what I have so far is I'm totally ignoring the system. I'm simply saying, given the demand, how do I make sure I have enough generation capacity at minimum cost? Okay, that's what this problem does. So it'll take, for example, in the example that I have here, I have 3 generators with all the different data. So you need all this data for it to work. The way the example is set up is that unit 1 is what's usually called base load. So it produces a lot of power at low cost, but it doesn't change very fast. Then unit 2 is what's called load following. It has a lower production capacity, but reacts a bit more quickly. And then unit 3 is a peaker, where it is expensive, but it ramps up and down very quickly. Okay, and these are typical of real units out there that are used. So the expectation when you optimize is that you'll try to use 1 as much as possible because it's the cheapest, and then 2, and then 3. There's kind of a priority ranking, but it depends on the context of what you need. So if you then also have these starting conditions that I'm going to skip for the sake of time, you'll get an output like this. So I've done this on 6 time periods. Thank you. I've done this on 6 time periods, and I've basically put demand for 6 time periods and a reserve amount for each of the time periods. And then you solve that optimization problem with all the data, and you get this. So what this says is that unit 1 will produce every period. That's the gray. The gray tells you when the unit is producing. Unit 2 will produce the first 2 periods and then turn off. And unit 3, the peaker, is off all the time except at period 5. Okay. And then you can spend some time looking at these amounts and seeing the dynamics. For example, unit 1 at period 4 is at 170 of level of output. If we go back, and then the next period has a demand of 230. So it's meeting all the demand at time 4. And if we go back, we can see that it could ramp to, if I just go back, it can ramp up by 50. So it could only ramp up to 220. So I need to bring something else in. But what I bring in for the next period is the third one instead of the second. Why do I bring the more expensive? Well, because then it drops again. There's a local peak at period 5. And it's cheaper to just bring this one in for 1 period than bringing in unit 2, which would have to be on for more than 1 period. And then it would make overall things more expensive. Okay. So you get these kinds of decisions being made depending on the structure of the data. You also get amounts for P bar, so this includes the reserve that I require a 10 reserve at all times. And then you also get dual variables, which in some sense give you pricing information. Okay, so this is the dual variable for the constraint that says you have to meet demand. So this gives you an estimate of the value of an additional unit of power in terms of meeting the demand, which is essentially like a marginal price. But I won't be talking very much about this for lack of time. And then you can also get a dual for the reactive constraint, okay, which currently is 0, which basically says there's, for the reserve constraint, excuse me, which basically says there's enough capacity for reserve, there's not really any value in providing additional reserve. So there's value in the providing additional power for the demand, for meeting demand, but not for meeting reserve. Okay.
So
Yes.
Maybe I just want, can I ask a question?
Ah, yes. I was forgetting about that.
So I suppose you fix binaries and then you get dual variables, right?
Yes, that's a very good point.
So
When you solve this problem, this gets us back into the algorithm part, which is important. When you solve this problem, these variables are binaries, the y's, v's, and z's. So you solve a mixed integer problem, and you get a solution. Even if your solver gives you duals, you can't trust them. You have to now fix the variables that are binary to the optimal decisions that were given. And now this problem becomes a linear optimization problem. All the variables that are left are continuous. Now you resolve, and you should get the same answer. But now you can trust the dual variables that come out of the process. Okay? Because the duality theory, as it's used in the solvers, only applies for problems without binary variables. So that's a very important point.
but maybe those dual variables are not supporting prices because the startup costs will be neglected in those prices, right? Then we need to uplift those prices.
Oh, that's well, yeah, but that's more of an implementation in the market issue. The optimization problem is not going to give you that. So that's also why I was saying these are estimates. These are kind of like prices, but that doesn't mean that you can just translate them straight into the market. But this will give you relative information. So in some sense, it says that in the first period, the marginal value of your power is higher than in the other periods, probably.
Yeah, but even if we talk outside the market, I'm not sure those dual variables are showing the cost of the next 1 megawatt generation if we have a startup cost in the next hour, right? Because the startup cost will not
change.
reflected in those duals if you fix the binaries.
So you mean because I have the startup cost up here?
Yeah, because startup costs are fixed already. So
Yeah.
that part in the objective function will be removed because it's constant then,
Yep.
right? And then the dual variables doesn't show the startup
That
cost.
doesn't include the startup cost. That's right. Yep. So there's, the way the model is set up here, there are limitations. I'm not, I don't want to claim too much in that respect. But what is important certainly is that if you solve the MIP, then these numbers, even if your solver gives you duals, they don't have any particular meaning at all. Here, maybe they can have some meaning once you've solved the continuous relaxation. But I'll let other lecturers talk more about markets and how you do the pricing. That's a good point. But you're absolutely right. The startup part is gone at that point. But the way I've got it set up here, it's not really even thinking about a market. It's thinking of minimum cost production and how much would it cost the system operator to procure an extra unit of power, but essentially assuming that this is the simple setup that we're using. Yeah. Okay. So that's a very basic model. I have some observations here that I'll leave for you to read later on the solution. Let's get to the network. So now we want to bring in the fact that we have a power transmission network behind all this. And there's two ways of doing it. You can do it with DC or you can do it with AC. If you do it with DC, this is the picture that I had before, you can add, I'll skip some of these for the sake of time, talking a little bit about modeling power flows. What you basically do is that you model voltage only using the voltage angles, and then you have the constant B, which technically is the negative of the series susceptance of the line. And I'll leave a future lecture to define exactly what that means and how it comes from the AC part. But basically you get a restriction that says the amount of power that can go on the line is limited by, is defined and is limited in some sense by how you set the voltages at each end of a line. Okay, you can't just assume you can send an arbitrary amount of energy through that line. And so you set up these constraints and you add them to the, maybe I'll just go through these steps. So one of the things you have to do is you have to take this meet the demand constraint and decompose it into meeting the demand at each node. Okay? So now because you have lines, you have to look at each node, each bus in the system, and have essentially meet demand at that bus. Think of it that way. And that's going to depend on how much you can take in and out on the lines that are connected to that bus. Okay? So the sum of generation minus the sum of demand on the neighborhood has to for a node looking at the neighborhood, it has to meet what can go through the lines. Okay. So this general constraint is now decomposed, which means that if we come back to the question of the dual variables, you will now get a dual variable for each node. Okay. And what it actually means is it comes back to the same discussion as before, but at least you get essentially nodal information in terms of duals. Now you need, step 2, you need to have capacity limits on a line. So there's only so much you can send across a line. And then you need to fix the voltage at some node because voltages are relative. So you fix a 0 as a reference node, and then you let the voltages fluctuate. Then you also have to look at the question of reserves, so you have to do the reserves as well. Typically, they're not done on a nodal basis, they're done on a reserve area basis. So you basically divide your network a priori in areas, and you say within each area, I need to have enough reserve. Okay. So the idea is that you should be able to route the reserve within the area as necessary if there is a need. But in the extreme, an area could be a single node, although that's not usually the case. And when you put all this together, here in red, I've put the pieces that have changed compared to the basic formulation. Okay, so I've replaced some of the pieces with these pieces in red, and that's the new model that now takes into account a DC version of the system. And now you can run this model with same data. Now I assume that there's a single reserve area for simplicity there. I have to decide where my generators are and where my demands are because I've added the system. So I've put the generators at nodes 1, 2, 3 to match the numbers of the generators, and then demand at nodes 4, 5, 6. So I have a 6-node system and a bunch of lines, and then what I do is basically I have lines from 1, 2, 3 to 4, 5, 6, except there's no line between 3 and 4. So I have an almost complete set of lines between generators and demands. I have to decide on the limits for the demand. I have to pick this susceptance value that I set to 0.8. Basically, these are realistic values. And then when you run, you get a solution that gives you the production. Now I have duals for each node, as I was mentioning. Now in this case, they don't change. They're essentially the same everywhere. And I have some solution for reserve. Okay. So if I use a DC model, if I'll just back up, I get this set of constraints that are still, I've added variables that are essentially the voltages, the voltage angles to be precise at each node. And now I have a more realistic description that takes into account how the power can actually flow from generators to demand. The problem is still to make sure you have enough generation to meet demand, but now it's saying you actually have to be able to flow through the system. Yeah, there's a question at the back. You want to do the honors?
Oh, maybe what Ivan, can you
Halfway
take it?
through, yeah. Maybe to, yeah. This is a team sport now to
Yes.
get the microphone around.
So now I did not manage to read too much through the optimization step, but is it anywhere where you solve Kirchhoff's laws?
Not yet. Well,
Like the
this
current
is a
and voltage
yeah. So
law?
Kirchhoff's law. This is essentially a simplified version. I'm going to get to them in a moment
Okay,
to get to an AC power flow.
okay,
So the answer is yes, but in a very simplified version.
okay.
So,
What about this DC network, considering network losses, transmission losses? Is there like variations on?
yes. So right now, the way I've put it, there are basically no losses.
Okay.
You can approximate losses in a DC setup. But if you want to have a more accurate, a really accurate view of losses, you need to have the AC version. Yeah. The advantage of the DC version is that this is still a linear problem with binary variables. Okay. When I now go to the AC, it's going to become a nonlinear problem. So let's do that. This is the example that, like I said, you'll be welcome to look through. Of course, you get power flows on the lines, and you get voltages and so on. All the data is here. You can change some things. Let me skip to there's also the security constraint version that I will skip for lack of time. This one is basically saying, I want to plan so that if there is a contingency, I still have a solution. So I'm going to find the optimal solution without contingency, but I will plan enough capacity that if a line disappears, for example, if a line stops working, or if one of the generators stop working, I have enough capacity online to continue operating. It won't be cost optimal anymore, but at least the system will hold. Okay. That's the idea for this formulation. And basically the way it works, I'll skip the details. Again, the red part is what's new compared to the basic one. The way it works is that you have a set of constraints for each possible contingency, for each possible contingency. So this says you optimize the normal state, but if there is any of the contingencies, there are other variables that say I can reroute things and I still have an ability to provide for demand. Okay. So it's still a linear problem. It's just a bunch of extra constraints that look at the possible contingencies that can come up. All right. Let's move on to the AC part that we've already been alluding to quite a bit. So, like I say, the DC has many advantages, but it doesn't provide a certain amount of information. This is a little bit about where the AC constraints come from. Let me pick here. What we have to have now is 3 new sets of variables. So I have the P's and the binary variables. I added the voltage angles when I did the DC. Now I'm going to add the voltage magnitudes, which are the V's. And then I have Q's that have to do with the reactive power. So the lowercase q's are the output of reactive power by generators. And the uppercase q's are the reactive power demands. Right? So I had the D's as demands. This was the demand in terms of active or real power. Now I'm going to have a demand in terms of reactive power as well at each node. And I'm going to have production of reactive power as the lowercase q's. Okay. And I have some capacities on the line that have to take into account both active and reactive. There's also something called the shunt susceptance that I'm going to skip for now. This is again the difference between the voltage angles at the ends of a line. I'm going to denote this with theta nm to be the difference between theta n and theta m. and then there's a sign convention that says which way the power flows on the line. Okay. Here are the equations. So this is now the AC version that says that at each node, the difference in production minus the difference in demand has to be equal to what's flowing on the lines. But now what's flowing on the lines is denoted by this expression instead of just the difference of the thetas that I had before. Okay. So we have the difference of the thetas in the cosine and the sine multiplied by the appropriate constants, then the whole thing multiplied by the two voltage magnitudes, and then I subtract this term here that involves voltage magnitudes as well. Okay. And I won't get into detail of where this comes from. I expect that some of the lectures later today or during the week will get into more detail on AC and how these come. This is the equation for active power. The bottom one is the equation for reactive power. So again, at each node, I have a load of reactive, I have a demand in reactive, and this is the corresponding expression for the flow of reactive power on each line connected to the node. Now, from an optimization perspective, when you look at this, this is not nearly as nice as just the difference of the thetas. Okay. And this is exactly what happens in practice. You also have now the limit on each line has to include the active part plus the reactive part. And what you do is you square the active flow, you square the reactive flow, so you essentially take away the signs. And the sum of those has to be bounded by the limit on the line. Okay. One way to think about this is that the reactive flow doesn't really count in terms of doing work. The reactive power doesn't count in terms of doing work. But to make the system work, to make the system function, I'll use a different word, to make the system function, you need to have it. And so it takes up capacity on the lines, but doesn't contribute to the actual active power that's the one that's of interest in terms of getting work done. Okay. So you have to account for that. The DC linearization is obtained by assuming that the conductance is negligible, so you set the G to 0, and then that you basically have small variations in voltage angle and voltage magnitude on every line, which allows you to say that the cosine of a very small amount here is 1, and the sine of a very small amount is essentially the amount itself. And now you assume that all the voltage magnitudes are 1 in what's called PU, normally, normalized units. So if you make all these assumptions, all the nastiness goes away from the optimization perspective and you have nice linear constraints. But you've lost a lot of information. And in particular, you've lost an accurate representation of the losses. But you can do all this. You can put it into the optimization problem with some bounds as well on the voltage magnitudes and the reactives. Okay, nothing major there. So really the action is that you now have these very nonlinear constraints to handle. Okay. And this introduces all sorts of issues, one of which is that it's much harder even for a convex objective to make sure you have a globally optimal solution. But in fact, it's much harder to get a solution because optimization solvers don't like these constraints in general. I've got a small example here. I wanted to get to this slide. As I've already mentioned, now we have a mixed integer nonlinear optimization problem. And one of the few solvers that does a very good job at attacking this particular kind of formulation for AC with AC power flow is called K-Nitro. Okay, and if you take this problem that I've got here and give it with, say, the data that I've put on the slides, to most solvers, they're going to not be able to find you a solution for different reasons. but these equations are very hard to handle in practice. But at least K-Nitro seems to be a reasonably good solver. The people who developed this solver have put a lot of effort into specifically being able to solve optimal power flow equations. These equations that I've very quickly breezed through are essentially also at the guts of the optimal power flow problem, and they're the challenge for solving those problems. Okay, so this solver reflects a lot of work that's been put on how to handle these equations from an optimization perspective. But still, what you get is what we call in optimization a stationary point at some point in the search tree for the integer part. There's no guarantee that you found the global optimum for the problem. Okay? It's very, very hard to do that. And one of the tools that's up and coming for being able to guarantee global optimality is a new set of ideas for convex relaxations, and Pascal will be speaking about that tomorrow. Okay? So we're making good headway in terms of attacking these problems from a global optimization perspective, but we're not there yet. There's still work to be done. One of the advantages, so the advantage of using the AC approach is that you get a lot more information, and in particular, what I want to point out of this is the flows of power. I think I have a better one, yeah. So these are the power flows on the lines. Okay, let's not worry too much about how we got here. So what this says is that here's my 6 nodes, row and column, and now these values are going to be positive if it's an outflow with respect to the column node. That's my convention. So what that means is that this 56 here is an outflow from, this is negative, so it's an inflow from 1 to 4. It's an inflow into 4 coming from 1. And this one here is an outflow from 1 going into 4. And what you see is that 56.6 is not the same as 57.7. So the amount that one injects into the line that goes to 4 is more than what arrives at 4 in terms of active power. These are the losses that were mentioned just before. Okay. In other cases, it's the opposite. The amount that arrives can be more than the amount that was injected. Okay. So one of the things that happens with AC is that you lose the symmetry. And you really have to look at what is happening at the endpoints and not just assume that it's symmetric. In terms of long lines, one way to simulate what happens with this model is to change the value of this parameter B shunt, which I didn't talk about at all as we zip through. It was set to 0 for the previous example. Now I can increase it a little bit. In physical terms, it means that the lines get longer. They behave like longer lines. This is very relevant in Quebec with those very long lines going north to south. Right? And one of the issues that happens is that as the lines get longer, they behave more like capacitors. So a capacitor can store energy, right? So the line itself becomes, in some sense, storage. Behaves like a capacitor in that sense. And if you work through the example, this is where one of these where at 1 I inject 58.97, but at 4 I receive 61.47. Okay? So now I have an anti-loss in some sense. More arrives than was injected at node 1. Okay? So this is not, this is part of the way things behave in an AC system. Okay? So what you actually have is an increase of 4% in the power that's injected at node 1 and arriving at node 4 in this example. So it really completely changes the dynamic. This effect is completely lost if you use the DC approximation. All these effects disappear because of these simplifications that I mentioned before. So on the one hand, if you use the AC model, you have a more accurate representation of an AC system. You have much more information coming out of the solution. The flip side is you're going to work much harder to solve the optimization problem. Of course, in some sense, it's the solver that does the work for you, but it's going to be limited on the size of problems that you can solve, the time it's going to take to solve them, and so on. So the ideal scenario is that we can solve very large instances of these problems in very short time. And that's still an ongoing topic of research, very active these days, in fact, especially in terms of convex relaxations for this kind of problem. Okay, DC, AC, that's bringing in the network into the system. I jumped over contingencies because I wanted to get to this part, which is talking about uncertainty. So there's two models for uncertainty that I want to mention. One of them is what's called the stochastic optimization approach. The other one is a kind of robust optimization approach. Okay? And these are things that I'm sure, again, you'll hear more about during the week from the other lectures. I'm going to show you one quick approach for each in the unit commitment context. Stochasticity is important, especially with renewables coming in. I don't need to justify it to this crowd. I think we're all convinced of this. So I'm going to look at two approaches to handle the uncertainty in the UC context. The stochastic approach is basically, in the way that I'm going to present it here, based on what's called a two-stage formulation. So the idea here is that the first stage is the decisions I make today for tomorrow. I have to decide today which units will be on and which ones will be off tomorrow. That's the first stage. And then based on that, I now make second stage decisions based on the number of scenarios. Okay. What will I do if demand is high? What will I do if demand is average? What will I do if demand is low? That's a very simplistic way of setting scenarios. But I have to make today's decisions so that I can cope with any of the three scenarios. And not only cope, but also I want to minimize cost. So each of these scenarios is going to incur a different cost, and I'm going to weigh that cost by the probability of each scenario and add it all up. So I'm going to optimize a probability-weighted version of the costs, a probability-weighted sum of the costs, and make the best decision I can today, not knowing which of the three scenarios will happen tomorrow. And in fact, what will happen tomorrow is probably neither of the three. But if I choose my scenarios well, I can make a decision today that will help me operate, that will allow me to operate tomorrow. And the decision will be hopefully at a very good cost in terms of the objective of the problem. So that's what the idea is. That's the philosophy. That's what I just went through. The limitations here is that whether this works well or not depends on the choice of scenarios. That's the critical input to this kind of formulation. The more scenarios you have, if they're chosen well, usually give you more accuracy. But at some point, having a lot of scenarios just increases the cost, and it's not clear how much it gives you in terms of increased accuracy. So you have to find the right trade-off between the number of scenarios and the amount of work that you're going to put into it. There is a big elephant in the room when it comes to these approaches, which is the probabilities. Okay. If I again say tomorrow I have three scenarios, high, average, low demand, what's the probability of each? Again, we get back to forecasting. This is the kind of information that historical knowledge and data science approaches and forecasting can inform how to pick these numbers. And how you pick these numbers, not just the scenarios, but the probabilities of the scenarios, is going to have a huge impact on what the outcome will be for the optimization. So if you can figure out the scenarios and the probabilities, the rest of it is straightforward. Okay. You can write this model that minimizes the deterministic cost of today's decisions, the first stage, and the expected cost of tomorrow's decisions. I have a set of scenarios that's omega. Little omega is an index for the scenarios, and the pi's are the probabilities. Pi omega is the probability of scenario omega. I assume the probabilities add up to 1. And then what I do here is the objective function has these two components. So the first part of the objective function is what I had before. This is the cost incurred by the commitment decisions that I make day ahead. Okay, plus the expected cost of the operation tomorrow. Okay, and these R's are the up reserve and down reserve deployed under the scenario, because basically what's going to happen is that you're going to have a kind of reserve that adjusts to your average depending on the scenario, and that's what comes into the cost of the expected part of the expected value part of the cost for the operation. So the CJ PJ here is the deterministic part that I expect on average, and then this is the cost of the deviation depending on the scenario. I have a couple of questions. Since the microphone is there, we'll start here. Yep.
So by force, do you need to discretize the distribution? Can you make it with a continuous distribution bounded?
The distribution of
the probability distribution of
the probabilities are discrete by definition because I have a probability for each scenario.
Can you use somehow a continuous?
Yes, you could. You could define these probabilities as a distribution, and then here you'd have an integral instead of a sum. Mathematically, that makes perfect sense. But then when it comes to optimization, you're going to have to discretize. So, yeah. But you can certainly do it, and that's been done. Yeah.
So I'm going to ask a fairly pragmatic question. How much better is the stochastic optimization approach compared to the non-stochastic optimization approach? So the solution that I come up with, how much more robust is it? How much cheaper is it in the different scenarios? And it may be out there in the research, but I'm just not up to date enough.
It's a very good question, a pragmatic question. There's no really easy answer to it. It's going to depend. Depending on the context, if there's too much, the real question, the real answer, let me come back this way. The real answer is how well can you pick the scenarios and the probabilities. If you don't have a good choice of scenarios and probabilities, you could end up essentially making commitment decisions that are much more expensive than they need to be. That's the definition of better in this context, right?
And my perspective was more sort of, so to say, if I am the system operator or the market operator, depending, so the person that has to solve the problem, why would I buy, so to say, your solution instead of what I currently have?
Absolutely.
Can you give me a number that tells me how much better this currently is compared to my current operations, and that way I can sort of relate to the solutions? Sure. It's again going back to the reliability / confidence in these kinds of models, right?
Absolutely, yes. What I would say is unless you give me a lot of information about your context, I cannot answer that question. If you give me enough data about your system that I can go away and do some work and come up with what I think is a good set of scenarios and what I think are good probabilities to match those scenarios, then I can run a bunch of models and look at the results and then come back and say, look, if you use this approach, I can show that I can do this much better. Would that be convincing or not? That's a separate question as well. But certainly, unless I have a lot of information about your system. It's very, well, I mean, I can play salesman and promise you lots of stuff. But if I want to be confident about what I'm promising, I would need to know a lot about your system to be able to feel able to quantify those impacts. But generally, you know, if the information going into the model is good, you should be able to do better. By how much and how much information you need to get there, that's very intangible in the abstract. Was there, yes?
It usually doesn't make it cheaper.
Hang on, we'll just wait for the, it's for the video that we want to have the microphone
So
on.
the stochastic approach usually doesn't make it cheaper, right? It's usually more expensive than the deterministic one.
Generally, it'll be more expensive, but the difference is that it'll be more accurate. Right? More expensive doesn't necessarily mean it's worse if it's more accurate with respect to what actually happens.
But over the long term, it should be cheaper because it's a more robust solution.
So,
I will
yeah.
avoid some situations where I can.
Yeah. It'll be, it'll be, it will be more expensive for the actual decision, possibly, but overall, compared to the real cost that you incur when you run the system, you should be able to gain. It's really more accurate, is really what it comes, you know, you're not comparing, it's not a matter of comparing the objective value of this one with the previous one, it's a matter of comparing to what actually happens when you run your system.
Basically, it's recursive for deviation.
Yeah. Because that's where this term comes in. This terms of the deviation, which before doesn't exist. You know, so you'll have a different value here probably, but then the question is how much deviation there is when you run in reality. But at the end of the day, it's the pragmatic question from before. You know, can you actually show an impact? That's I think the research is very much still into how do you solve the question of getting this information, which is far from trivial, and then how do you solve this efficiently? And until we have good, solid solutions for those two questions, it's going to be limited how much you can get it into practice. So there's lots of work for you guys to work on, and lots of things to still improve. I think there was a question just back there. Gentleman that picked up my high throw before. Yes. That was you. You had to jump up.
Yeah, sure. Yes, now to judge the value of the stochastic solution,
Yes.
one would need a simulator or some kind of out-of-sample data, right?
Yeah.
And
Short of actually implementing it in practice, you could use. Well, you could sort of optimize or simulate a posteriori. So give me today's information, and I go back in time and I say, okay, using my methods and what I knew at the time, what would I decide, and how would it work out based on what actually happened? So you can do that kind of a posteriori simulation or evaluation to see how well your model would behave.
And is this usually done?
Is this usually done? It's going to depend on how, I would say depends on how, you know, interested people are in testing those models. I mean, certainly the researchers, if they would have access to all this information, I would do it, because I'd be interested in doing it, and it put a lot of added value to my papers. But, you know, again, when you deal with people in practice, they're interested, but you have to really go through this very high hurdle of, you can trust my tool. And that's, I mean, there's even an intermediate step between the two, which is that they have to trust your tool, but then usually it has to be implemented in some kind of commercial system, which is what they actually use in production. So then you have to get a company that does that into the picture, which specifically in my context, Hydro-Quebec is the utility that's interested, and Schneider Electric is the provider of service that would be interested in implementing whatever solution they're interested in buying. So you need that component as well into the whole picture. Jalal? Yeah. Okay.
Yeah, my question has to do more with the solver.
when you want to solve these kind of problems, and knowing that the more scenarios you take into account, the more complex. Do you take advantage of a special structure of the problem, so you use like progressive contingency incorporation or kind of strategies? Like this particular problem have a particular a structure that you can take advantage of?
Yes, so if I just skip ahead and go to the formulation here, this is what the stochastic formulation would look like. This is the objective part that we've talked about already quite a bit. The rest of it is actually fairly straightforward, except that you have expected demand here, and you have a fluctuation in the, the P's are adjusted. Everything else is pretty much straightforward by scenario, so there's not much changing there from the optimization perspective. When you want to solve this, obviously you have a lot of structure. A lot of these constraints are indexed by scenario. So for each scenario you have a chunk of these that corresponds. And then there's a lot of decomposition methods or other kinds of solution techniques that can kick in. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Now, which ones kick in depend on the structure. Mm-hmm. And that's a whole other presentation on how you go about solving these kinds of problems. But absolutely, you would want a solver that understands the structure of the problem, which is quite a tall order. Some of the more recent versions of Cplex now have a way of doing Bender's decomposition automatically. So if that would work for your problem, that's something that helps. But in most cases, you have to go back to doing your own implementation, which is a whole, almost like a PhD project in itself, because implementing these things is not easy. And that's part of the challenge of making them reliable, is that you have to really build your own thing in most cases. Once you get into the AC part, once you get into the stochastic part, and then the next one, the robust part, you really are at or beyond the limits of current solvers. And unlike the linear integer part, where you can more or less get it off the shelf and run, it's a different territory. Okay. All right, so that's the stochastic version very quickly. I did skip a few slides on constraints, but like I said, these are really just adaptations of previous constraints. The match production demand per scenario, ramping per scenario, generation limits per scenario, and then bounds on these adjustments, right? You can't just adjust too much up and down from your expected production on your model. You put it all together, you get this formulation. Okay. That's the stochastic approach, very, very quick. Again, there's a small example, 3 scenarios as I was saying before, one where the demand is lower than expected, one where the demand is equal to expected, where demand is higher, probabilities that I've picked off the top of my head, literally, and you solve them and you get an optimal cost and so on. So this cost is now, actually I think the data's changed. I'm not sure if it's the same data. I was going to say this cost has gone up, but I think the data's changed as well. I'm not sure. We can compare it. What you do get is optimal schedules for each scenario, because now you have variables for each scenario. So here's my P's for the first stage, and then here's my P's adjusted per scenario. So I say in the first stage, my P1 at time 1 is 160, and then using those R variables per scenario, I go down to 148 or up to 170, depending on the scenario. Okay. So these would be the actual schedules for each of the scenarios, and they're all based on adjustments to this sort of basic average scenario that comes from the first stage. Okay. That's what these solutions look like. And again, you have a bunch of constraints for demand, so you have a bunch of dual variables that come from each scenario, and so on and so on. This is pretty big, by the way. We were talking about solution methods. These constraints are all per generator, per time period, per scenario. Okay. So if you have, 50 generators, 24 time periods, and 50 scenarios, well, you do the math, right? We're into triple figures very quickly. Quadruple figures very quickly even. Yes?
Quick question. How parallelizable is the code which is like the unit commitment problem? And a follow-up question is that when you have a multi-stage stochastic optimization, can you update your probability values at every interval, or is it like you set it, or actually in practice, do you just set it at the start of the day for the next 24 hours, or you say that I'm going to have a value which is updated with every hour being realized?
Oh, I see. Okay. So the answer to the first problem is that parallelization of these solution techniques is, again, you do it, right? I mean, there's no standard package out there that's going to do as well as if you do your own approach. But even how you parallelize is still a subject of research. That's a very good but very tough question. In terms of these probabilities, well, you could change them per time period, but that's not really the spirit of the model. The spirit of the model is you have, a bunch of scenarios for the future, and each one has a probability of happening. So why would you make the probabilities depend on what happens, the time steps tomorrow is not clear. Mathematically, there's no problem. I put a t there and I'm done. But I don't see, certainly on the, at the moment, I don't see why that would make sense from the application.
I was just wondering that in the sense that if you're way off with your probability distribution initially,
Yeah.
and you want to update it in real time, or you want to update it as the scenario gets realized, then if it is possible to do so or not.
Then you would do it for the next day. Because remember, I'm planning day ahead. I've already made commitments for the next day. It's too late. What I can do is the next day I need to do day ahead again and say, oh, I really messed up. Let me adjust. But you wouldn't be time dependent here. Yeah. Okay. Right. Let's move on to the robust approach that I wanted to make sure that I touch on. This version of robust unit commitment. The idea here is going to be, this is a little bit about robust optimization and adaptive robust optimization. The idea here is to try to overcome some of the drawbacks of stochastic optimization. So I don't have to have scenarios, and I don't have to estimate probabilities. But now I'm going to have something else. What I'm going to have is I'm going to have what's called a deterministic uncertainty set that uses a different set of quantities to incorporate uncertainty into the model. Now, let me show you exactly what I mean by this. What I'm going to do is have a model that has what are called 3 levels. Okay. Has anyone here heard about bi-level programming before? Have a show of hands? Oh, that's good. That's very good. This is tri-level. Okay, you thought bi-level was hard? This is tri-level. So I have 3 levels of optimization. What this means is that there is a first level that's an optimization problem. Within the constraints of that problem, I have an optimization problem, which is the second level. And now, with tri-level, within the constraints of this second level problem, I have an optimization problem. Okay. And if you think this is not easy to solve, you got it. Okay. Bi-level is already quite a challenge. There was a workshop last week that I was at on bi-level programming. And the capabilities for solving bi-level problems, unless they're very special, is quite challenging. Okay. But it is a really nice model for this whole problem of integrating renewables in the system. So let me show you how this works. We do have the 3 levels. The first level is still my day ahead decision. I have to schedule which units will be on and off tomorrow, and I want to do it at minimum cost. What's going to happen is that now the second and third level, it's a little bit of a game with my opponent. So this really becomes a game theory setup as well. On the first level, I make my decision to schedule the units. Okay. The second level is the demand. The net demand is the variable. And what's going to happen is that the net demand that includes renewable production is going to make things as bad as possible for me based on the decisions I've made. Okay. So I'm playing against the output of renewable generation, and it's going to try to make my life as hard as possible. That's where the robustness comes in. I am going to optimize for the, in some sense, the worst possible outcome, but instead of having to predict what this outcome is going to be using a scenario and a probability, I'm going to optimize it. I'm going to say the renewable output is going to be an optimization problem that will make things as worse as possible for me. But it can't just do whatever. It has to take into account that tomorrow I will I will actually run these units, and they will do what they can to cope with the realized demand, the realized renewables. So the third level is that given the schedule and the worst case demand, I'm going to dispatch the units to minimize the cost again. Okay. So first, day ahead, I decide which units go on. That hasn't changed. What happens tomorrow is that the renewables will realize themselves in the worst possible way for me, but taking into account that I will have units to schedule to account and react to what happens. Okay. Which is my optimization problem tomorrow. Having decided what I fixed in terms of on and off decisions, I will decide how much each unit actually produces. And I can do this knowing how bad the demand is already at that point. Okay. So this is a way to get around the scenarios question. It's a way to get around the forecast question to some extent, because I can allow my renewables to really behave in a very negative way for me. Okay. But it makes my solution more expensive. Okay. Now I'll be able to deal with a very large fluctuation in terms of renewables, and in fact the worst possible ones for the decision I've made. Of course, if I schedule enough units, I'll be fine. But I pay a very high cost. So my objective is still to minimize my cost, but knowing that the demand is going to essentially play against me. And I don't have to guess what the future is going to be. I'm going to let it be as bad as it can, but also given the fact that I can react on the day with the units that I've scheduled. Okay. There was a question. I think there was a gentleman next to you first. Yeah.
Yeah, thank you. If you were to make this a little easier, could you say that you restrict your recourse actions on the third level to a class of functions that is easy, like linear functions, and then you take them into the first level, and then you have just a bi-level program instead of a...
You're getting into how the heck do we solve this thing?
Yeah.
And that is essentially what I'm going to do.
Okay.
But conceptually,
Yeah.
I don't have to do that.
No,
This
of
is
course
the
not.
setup. Yeah.
Yeah.
The question is, how do I make it solvable in some way? Yes. There was a question there.
In the context of the second level
Yes.
part, where you basically assess your net demand, and you said that you take into account the worst possible case for renewables somehow,
Yes.
right? What makes this worst case be different than zero? Because basically this is your worst case for renewables. They do not produce anything. What makes your problem be less trivial than this?
If you make it zero, then you're essentially defeating the purpose of the model. You're taking the renewables out of the picture. So what this model is going to say to solve that problem is it's going to put some kind of limits on how much renewable you can have. So you have to have a minimum amount, for example.
Yes, but this is against stochastic.
Sure.
So it's...
You need to have, but you can make it very large. I mean, the point is, I don't have to know if it's much easier to have some kind of bounds than to get scenarios or to get, a more accurate forecast of what's going to happen. I'm really going to say make it as bad for me as you can in terms of the renewable output. And in some cases it may not be zero. It depends on how the system is set up.
It just seems like...
Maybe I'll just show a few details and
Okay,
then,
yes,
and then we can
yes.
look at that. Yeah. There's another question. Yes.
I'm just curious, so when they choose the worst case scenario, will it actually capture all this in like sudden increases and sudden decreases?
You can, as long, because basically it's going to say that's one aspect where it can get very bad. You know, you can have, if you think of the duck curve in California, you have very steep, you know, ramp down one way and ramp up the other way to accommodate the solar. You can basically say, given the units that I've scheduled, how bad can you make it for me in terms of ramping?
So this worst case realization is actually capable of capturing those kind of...
It would actually say, given the decision I've made,
Okay.
how bad can the duck curve be for me, for example? And that's not zero, right? Now, you know, this thing has, there's some installed capacity, so there's only a maximum, and it never quite goes to zero. So, you know, you can put some limits, but really it is saying, if you think of California, you know, given the decisions that I've made to commit units, how bad could the duck curve be? And this is going to optimize it. It's going to make it as bad as it can. But then I have a recourse, essentially, of saying, okay, now I've scheduled these units, so even if you make it very bad, I can still adjust. But the bottom line is, it's going to make it more expensive for me. And that's getting back to the question before of, from the optimization cost, it's more expensive, but maybe it gives me a better handle on reality to cope with situations than using scenarios and probabilities. You know? But if you're happy with scenarios and probabilities, for all that I was saying that the stochastic model is hard to solve, it's much easier than this. Right? So that's what I will do if I'm happy with it. I think there was a question next to you. Yeah.
I'm just wondering, I'm not so familiar with this problem you're talking about. I'm just wondering, so on the second level, you said you wanted to maximize basically the worst case scenario, is it?
I want to, so the renewables are going to try to make my production cost as large as possible.
Right, so basically you want to find the worst possible case. But why the worst possible case in the second level is going to make the overall solution optimal rather than a reasonable worst case scenario, if you get what I mean?
Okay, so the reasonable idea is the stochastic idea, stochastic optimization idea. Reasonable means the kind of expected scenario or some kind of reasonable scenario. Here it's saying I'm going to let reality be as nasty as it can be. And what that means is that it's going to make my production cost higher. And my objective is to keep the cost down. But instead of basing my optimization of cost on scenarios or on reasonable assumptions, I'm going to base it on how bad can reality be for me tomorrow? To the extent that I let reality optimize itself to be as bad as possible for me as it can. And the outcome, like I was saying, is that I'm assuming that in the very worst case scenario, if I put enough units online, I can cope with it. But it'll be very expensive. So my question is, how much can I save in terms of not turning on units? And even if reality does the worst it can against me, I can still survive. Okay.
But then it feels like it's very conservative in a way.
Absolutely.
That in reality, if you are not optimized the worst possible manner, that you could have achieved a little better than this
Absolutely.
outcome.
Yeah. But if I don't schedule enough production and I have a blackout, that'll be a lot worse. That's the trade-off, you know. How rosy do I want my glasses to be, you know? Do I want to assume that the future is pink, or do I want to assume that it's black? And this approach is basically saying, I'm going to see the future in the worst possible light. And I want to make sure that I still generate enough, I still schedule enough capacity to survive. But you're right, it's very pessimistic.
But then you can set boundaries, right? Like to make it realistic.
Sorry, let's just wait. Is that all right? There you go. You can do it. 1, 2, 3. Yeah. Well done.
I was just saying that you can set some boundaries, upper
Yes.
and lower boundary, to make it realistic.
Yes.
Otherwise, it goes like.
Yeah, you have to put it in a box. I mean, in robust optimization, there's this idea that you have some kind of uncertainty set, you know. But you can make the uncertainty set very big, or not. But if you don't make it big enough, it somewhat defeats the purpose of robust optimization. Because now you're almost predicting what it's going to be. Yeah, you're deciding what it's going to be. So for these models to be useful, you still have to allow enough uncertainty that it can really optimize against you. There was a question over there?
I just had a comment on robust optimization. Yeah, but I think I can say, so for the person who asked the question before that, it's actually just you need to think about what is being optimized. When we're talking about robust optimization, we're minimizing the chance of system failure. And when we're talking about stochastic optimization, it's optimizing the expected output of the system. And that's where it's coming from, and it's here, like used also in catastrophe prevention and other theories like that. So it's just, we are not actually, yes, it makes results worse, but that's the whole point. We are thinking about, the goal is to make it as robust, as stable to different worst case, or not even worst case, so to all possible scenarios. So that's why it looks weird, maybe, but it's because it's built in with a different objective in mind.
Thank you.
Just a comment on this. Isn't there kind of like a midway point in which we use the scenarios, but we pick the worst possible scenario and we optimize against that? So it's taking kind of like both sides.
Yeah, that's an interesting point. I mean, you can use stochastic optimization and have very pessimistic scenarios. This could be a way of generating pessimistic scenarios. You know, if you want to think of it that route, you know, these things are not mutually exclusive. You could use this kind of optimization approach to see, I mean, the second level model to see, you know, how bad are my concepts of a bad scenario.
So we're talking about robust stochastic optimization.
You could do, yeah. I mean, there's many variants of, the word robust is used with a number of different meanings, right? There's not one way of doing robust optimization. There's not one way of doing stochastic optimization as well. But fundamentally, the idea for robust is that it's much more conservative in general. It's much more pessimistic, if you want to think of it that way. But it can also help you prevent, probably better, help you prevent really bad situations.
I also comment on that.
Okay.
There are actually models that optimize with respect not to expected value, but to tail probability, which is exactly what you were saying.
So it's kind of a CVAR type of approach. Yeah. So there's many other ways of presenting that. I still have 10 minutes, right? Oh, it's 12:30. Oops. Okay. Sorry. My mistake. Oh, my computer's also decided I'm done. So you can, I'm sorry, I thought I had, for some reason, it was the break that was at 1:45 that was confusing me. So in any case, we will stop there. You've got the slides, as I was saying, and you're welcome to, I'll be very happy if I can type my password. There we go. I'll have to skip the details, but basically there's quite a bit of things. I'll just finish with the problem. This is what it looks like. So now what you have to do is to somehow solve, you know, this 3-level optimization problem And there's more information on this in the reference that I gave you. So I'll stop there. Thank you.